We often think of the American Revolution as something that started with a single gunshot. But the reality is, the decision to actually go for independence, that wasn't made overnight. It was forged in the fire of just a few crucial months in 1775, a time when every single hope for peace was finally extinguished. This is the story of that exact moment, the point of no return.
Okay, so picture this. It's April 1775, and a ship is leaving London carrying what is supposed to be a final peace offer to the American colonies. But here's the thing about history. The timing can be absolutely brutal. That journey across the Atlantic took about 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. So by the time this so-called olive branch finally arrived in June, it landed in a country that was already at war. The message was useless before anyone even opened it.
So what did the Continental Congress do? Well, with guys like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson at the table, they flatly rejected the offer. And why? Because it didn't touch on the one thing that started this whole mess. Parliament's claim that it had the right to tax them. They listed a whole bunch of other problems, like harsh new laws, and basically said it was too little, too late. The door to negotiation was slammed shut.
With diplomacy officially off the table, the conflict was about to get a whole lot bigger. Over in Boston, 2 armies were squaring off, and they were about to learn a very, very bloody lesson at a place called Bunker Hill.
So let's set the scene. Inside the city of Boston, you've got 6,000 professional British soldiers, the best in the world, but they're completely trapped. And surrounding them on the high ground, a sprawling force of 15,000 New England militiamen. Now these guys are passionate, for sure, but they are an undisciplined, disorganized mess. It's the classic showdown, a small professional force versus a huge amateur army.
The British commanders were, let's just say, not impressed. This quote from General Burgoyne says it all. They literally saw the Americans as an undisciplined rabble. And that arrogance led them to make a really terrible decision. They decided to launch a direct, frontal assault to just crush the Americans and make an example out of them. And what happened next was just pure carnage. The British marched straight up the hill, shoulder to shoulder, right into a wall of lead. The Patriots waited, held their fire until the last second, and then just unleashed a volley that completely shattered the British lines. The Redcoats fell back, regrouped, and their commanders unbelievably ordered a second charge, which ended in the same bloody mess. It was only on the 3rd try, when the Americans literally ran out of ammunition, that the British were finally able to take the hill.
Yeah, they took the ground, but just look at the cost. It was absolutely staggering. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. That's nearly half the force they sent in. Compare that to about 450 casualties for the Patriots. That undisciplined rabble had just inflicted horrifying losses on one of the best armies in the world.
And this is the really crucial point. Tactically, it was a loss for the Americans. They gave up the hill. But for their morale, it was a massive victory. It proved to them and to the world that they could stand toe-to-toe with British regulars. And for the British, as General Clinton himself said, it was a terrifying wake-up call. They realized this rebellion was not going to be an easy fight.
Okay, so even after the bloodbath at Bunker Hill, the political wheels were still turning behind the scenes. There was about to be one last, desperate attempt to find a peaceful solution.
That attempt was called the Olive Branch Petition, and it's really important because it shows us that even at this late stage, many colonists still didn't want independence. They had this belief that King George was a good guy who was just being misled by his corrupt ministers in Parliament. So they bypassed Parliament entirely and sent this plea directly to him, begging to restore harmony. It was, truly, their last hope.
But while that petition was slowly sailing across the ocean, something absolutely explosive happened in Virginia. The royal governor, Lord Dunmore, issued this proclamation. He offered freedom to any enslaved person who would escape their patriot master and come fight for the king. For Southern landowners, this was the ultimate betrayal. It threatened to destroy their entire social and economic structure. This single act turned countless moderates into full-blown revolutionaries, practically overnight.
Right in the middle of all this, in July 1775, George Washington arrives to take command of the new Continental Army. And what he finds is a complete disaster. There's no discipline, no supplies, not even enough guns to go around. He immediately starts imposing order, but maybe his most brilliant decision had nothing to do with fighting. He ordered the entire army to be inoculated against smallpox, a move that probably saved it from being completely wiped out by disease.
As winter set in, both sides were just in a miserable stalemate. The British were still stuck in Boston, dealing with their own smallpox outbreak and running out of food.
Meanwhile, Washington's army was freezing, starving, and facing a huge crisis. Most of the soldiers' enlistments were about to expire. Both armies were on the verge of totally collapsing.
So, with the armies locked in this desperate frozen standoff, the final decision wasn't going to be made on a battlefield. The one that would determine whether this was just a protest or an all-out war for survival was going to be made 3,000 miles away, in London.
And here it is, the final, decisive blow. The Olive Branch Petition arrives in London. King George III refuses to even look at it. Instead, he goes before Parliament and gives a speech. And as you can see from this quote, he's not talking about peace. He's talking about putting a speedy end to these disorders with decisive exertions. The message couldn't be clearer.
The king himself personally declared that the American cause was a desperate conspiracy. He officially labeled the colonies as being in a state of open and avowed rebellion. He put the blame squarely on the Americans and promised to meet their actions with overwhelming military force. With those words, the king himself slammed the door on peace. There was absolutely no going back.
That declaration from the king was the final push. This was no longer a squabble over taxes and rights. It was the birth of a cause. It was the beginning of the fight for independence.
And you can literally feel this incredible shift in the words of the American leaders. General Nathaniel Greene here, he's not talking about his rights as an Englishman anymore. He's talking about dismembering the British Empire and raising a new American empire. This was a seismic change in thinking, and it happened almost overnight.
Even the normally cautious George Washington was completely resolute. His words made it crystal clear. The goal was no longer reconciliation. The goal was a complete and total break from a state he now saw as unjust and unnatural. So you see, it wasn't just one thing. It was a cascade of events that all happened in a few short months. Bunker Hill proved they could fight. Dunmore's proclamation showed the Crown was willing to upend their entire society. American towns were being burned. And finally, the king's own words confirmed there was no peaceful path forward. Independence was the only option they had left.
The decision had been made. A cause was forged in the crucible of 1775. But this, of course, raises the ultimate question. Now that the point of no return was passed, could this fledgling army, this collection of rebels, actually stand a chance against the full might of the British Empire? The fight for independence had only just begun.